thanks a lot for being so many for this webinar on the enforcement of EU law. I'm really delighted of having top experts here with us. We have, of course, first and foremost, Professor Kelemen, who has been leading, together with his colleague, Tommaso Pavone, excellent and interesting research on the state and changes of enforcement of EU law. And we are privileged to see here today his figures, some of his figures which are forthcoming to be published, and also cover the area of environmental law. We are also privileged to have with us a lawyer from the top NGO about EU law enforcement on the European stage of ClientEarth, of course, Anaïs Berthier, and she has been, and her organization have been bringing cases forward to court in order to help enforcing systematically in different member states EU law, a work which has been done in similar way also by the Deutsche Umwelthilfe and many other environmental NGOs in Germany. And we are particularly honored to have Director Ciobanu-Dordea with us. I hope my pronunciation is somehow understandable, who is responsible in the Directorate General Environment just for this issue of enforcing EU environmental law. And I think we took really the right day for our webinar today, because it was just today that the European Court of Justice has ruled that Hungary has been, since 2005, violated fine particle emission ceilings. So since 16 years, poor Hungarians had to suffer from air which was not according to EU standards. And this is therefore an example for what we talk about. We have good environmental legislation in Europe, nature, environment, often even animal rights. But the reality of enforcement in the member states is not on the same level. And it takes painstakingly long until often infringement cases lead to changes. And even today, the Hungarians do not yet know what will the fine be, which will finally make their government move. So therefore, this is a really topical issue. And Ursula von der Leyen, when she presented her Green Deal, which was a great success after the environmental mobilizations and also with the European elections, she promised in her Green Deal to enforce environmental law more stringently. And therefore, this is a good opportunity today to look at the figures and reflect on the state of the enforcement of environmental law, because it is clear the best law is only good if it is truly implemented. And this is why we want to discuss today, where do we stand? So we will listen to Professor Kelemen's recent research and hear from practitioners of EU law enforcement from NGO and European Commission. And we have lots of participants today here in the webinar who are working with this as NGOs, as citizens, or simply because they are interested. And you are here in the 75th webinar of my series Europe Calling, which is bringing European people closer to EU politics and EU decision makers. I'm proud to say that we have reached now more than 60,000 people directly with these webinars, and this is one of them. And now quickly on the rules. The rules here are, first, we are polite with each other. We discuss on substance. We want to learn. We want to make politics a better place. And this is why respect is always what is important, but also open and frank words. Beyond that, we are lucky if people are spreading the news. So if you see exciting news, things said important, please tweet about it, put it on social media so that more people learn about it. And you can also now share my tweet which is announcing that this webinar is due to start. So more people, even than the 1,000 plus, can register. And finally, you can also, after we heard from our guests, you can also raise your questions and raise your voice. For this, you have to use the hand symbol in your communication list of tools, and or you type under the F&A Q&A function your question. And you can also like the question of others so that the best questions are actually in any case addressed afterwards. If you represent an organization, a media, a lobby, please say so or put it in your question so that we have transparency. Transparency is a high standard in European politics, much better than in the member states, and therefore we will continue in this logic here as well. So now, I'm Sven Giegold, the spokesperson of the German Greens in the European Parliament, and now I give the floor to Professor Kelemen, and we are all delighted to have your presentation here. Professor Kelemen, from the US, Philadelphia.
Yes, thank you. I'm feeling very cut off from all my friends in Europe during this pandemic, so it's nice to be able to join you in this webinar. And I just wanted to say, Sven, it's an honor that you invited me to join you for this presentation and the other distinguished guests. And I would just say that it's particularly nice for me personally because although I haven't been working on environmental policy specifically so much in recent years, that's basically where I started all my studies of European politics and the EU. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on the German Green Party, in fact, and then I wrote my PhD dissertation on the enforcement of EU environmental law, both by the Commission and by NGOs like the one Ms. Berthier works with. And so, this is a topic that even if I've moved into more general issues of EU law enforcement, I've always had in the back of my mind the environment and environmental policy. So I'll try to bring that up in my talk. So now I'm going to share my screen so I can show you some of these figures on the data here. All right. All right. Does that look good to everyone? You can see my slide. All right. So, we're going to talk now about what my colleague Tommaso Pavone from the University of Oslo and I call the curious case of the declining infringement procedures. Okay, that's a Sherlock Holmes reference for those who aren't familiar. But what we're getting at here is that something dramatic has been happening with infringement procedures in recent years. And I'll show you figures to back that up in a second. But first, let me just give a little context here. One of the central roles of the European Commission, famously, is the role of the guardian of the treaties. And one of the key ways it exercises that role is through what are called infringement proceedings under Article 258 of the treaties, where, and this is a multi-step procedure. There's a letter of formal notice to the government, there's a reasoned opinion, and eventually there can be a referral to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, right? Now, this, what we can call centralized enforcement. So enforcement by the Commission is crucial, even though NGOs on the ground in the member states can also play a big role in bringing legal actions. And I'm sure we'll hear about ClientEarth's work on that. Despite that work, the role of the Commission in bringing infringements remains crucial because the Commission has certain remedies and tools at its disposal that give it a unique role in the process. And we should keep in mind that compliance, and you were getting at this, Sven, it's an enduring challenge, right? It's not like the compliance problems and have been resolved in environmental policy or other issues, right? And there's been new challenges to compliance with bringing in more member states, for instance, the crisis of governance in the EU. There have been multiple crises that have raised new compliance issues. And then in some member states, such as Hungary and Poland, we've seen a deterioration in the rule of law, which then creates even more compliance problems. So this issue remains crucial. Now, let's start with the figures. Oh, and actually, even before I say that, let me just say that on environmental policy specifically, it's been clear throughout that enforcement by the Commission and the director, Ciobanu-Dordea, will tell us about this, I'm sure, has always had a really important role because, even though there are NGOs who work on it, the environment can't sort of protect itself. It needs actors, to step in, and the commission is a crucial one, right? Okay, so now let's look at the figures. So what we see on this chart is the trends in both letters of formal notice, that's stage 1 of a commission infringement action, and then referrals to the Court of Justice, the darker line, right? That's the sort of final stage where they go to court. And here you see the trends from the 70s up till 2004. Clear trend, up, up, up. More and more infringement actions over time. Here are the trends since 2004. Down, 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 right? There's an 80% reduction in referrals to the Court of Justice since 2004, a 60% reduction in even the commencement of infringements. So something clearly happened, right? And I would just say, it's not a phenomena. You might say, oh, maybe it's driven by trends in just a couple states. No, we don't need to go through this chart in detail, but what this just shows you is this decline in infringements affects almost every member state, right? So that trend of up and then down is happening everywhere. It happens in almost all policy areas. We don't have the data back to the 70s by policy area. This only goes to like 2002. But if you look by policy area, it's happening across the board in issues of EU law. And here specifically on environment, right? The figures for 2002, I think, were a little dicey for different reasons. That was the first year of the new tracking system on the Commission website. But clearly you can see that the letters of formal notice, that's the blue line, are going down, and referrals to the Court of Justice going way down from where they were in 2004 to a dramatically lower level of referrals of environmental cases per year. Okay, again, this is just in the last 15 years or so. Now, some people might look at that decline and say, oh, well, maybe there's a simple solution. There's less enforcement actions because compliance is better, right? You might say, oh, well, we don't need to bring cases because everyone's complying with the law. We don't see any evidence for that. First of all, I'm sure the other panelists can tell us about many of the, or Sven, about many of the enduring environmental problems in Europe, air quality, et cetera, that you were talking about. But beyond that, a piece of evidence we look at is individuals can file complaints with the Commission where they detect violations of environmental law. And what you see here with this gray line, even though there's a break where there was no data for a few years, but the point is complaints to the Commission have continued to rise up till the present, right? Even in the period where the infringements are going down. So complaints sort of suggest violations of EU law and that there's not compliance. So all in all, we don't think there's any reason to believe that compliance suddenly got systematically better since 2004. So something else happened, clearly, right? Now, some people might also say, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of going through the usual suspects, like in an Agatha Christie murder mystery, right? Where you line up the potential suspects and see, could they be the guilty party or whatever. Well, so some people might say, maybe this decline in infringements is because there's just less legislation being produced. Now that I think has some role. It's true the EU's making less legislation, so that could have an impact. But again, what the gray line shows you here is the legislative output from the EU. And you see that's been in like steady decline since the late 80s, a kind of slow and steady decline. So that slow and steady decline doesn't seem like it can explain the sudden decline since 2004 in infringements. And there was about 20 years when legislative output was declining while infringements were still going up. Okay, so that doesn't seem to be the answer. Now, some people, and perhaps Ms. Berthier can say something about this too, that some people say, well, maybe infringements by the Commission are going down because private parties are taking care of enforcement by bringing more actions in national courts, which generate a different kind of case. Those are called preliminary references, where national courts can refer cases to the European Court of Justice where there are cases involving questions of EU law. Some people would say, well, that's the new solution, is a decentralized enforcement by NGOs. But again, if we look at the trends, it doesn't seem to fit because preliminary references, yes, they have been going up, but again, in recent years they've even been going down a bit, And so that doesn't seem to explain the decline. And just the timing of these changes doesn't suggest a strong correlation. Okay. So now let's turn to the Commission, the official statements of policy. It's not as though they've ignored this or never said anything about it. If you go back to 2007, they announced a new approach to enforcement, right? They called it a Europe of results, a new approach to enforcing community law. And they said they were going to focus on prevention and dialogue, and basically trying to resolve issues before they had to go to litigation. Okay, so they said, for instance, the need for recourse to infringement proceedings should be reduced. So this was a clear policy, right? And just basically focus on the most important ones. And I just want to pause to say something here, which an audience. Basically, I think a lot of people, when they thought about infringements, they specifically had in mind often environmental ones. And they thought, the Commission is bringing too many detailed cases on very specific environmental infringements in one region of one country and things like that. And they said, we should just be focusing on the biggest issues facing Europe. And we should leave those things to sort of governments to resolve at a more local level. But again, I think, as Sven pointed out at the beginning, things like air quality, these aren't small. They're big. They affect people's health. And so, this is, I think, part of the tension here. Another thing was, to avoid infringements, they created a new kind of procedure called the pilot procedure, where basically they were trying to, again, resolve issues before they actually became potential infringement cases through dialogue. Okay, so, but like with that pilot procedure, some people would say, oh, everything's being resolved through this pilot, so they don't need infringements. That's what some people would say. But pilots have actually been declining in recent years. So again, that doesn't seem to explain the continued decline of infringements. So something else is going on. So here, I'm almost done now, just to wrap up. Do I have 2 more minutes, Sven? Yeah.
Sure, Dan, in particular because I got your name wrong, but it's really fascinating. Go on.
Okay. Well, so listen, we're not, my colleague Tommaso and I, we're conducting a lot of interviews with officials. Maybe Director Ciobanu-Dordea can talk to us later. We'll see. But we're trying to understand why this is happening, and it's still ongoing, our research. So I'm just going to give you some ideas we've had from our discussions in lieu of definitive conclusions. I think if you go back to this time in the early 2000s, a lot of critics of EU regulation perceived the Commission and the EU as being too litigation-oriented, too legalistic, right? And meddling too much in the affairs of member states. And so there was a perception among many that we need to step back, the Commission, and have a lighter touch, right? This was related to this idea, the better regulation agenda, which Barroso pushed and Juncker continued, right? Which is, again, saying, let's discourage strict legalistic approaches, resolve things through dialogue, et cetera. So all this was pushing for avoiding litigation, right? Also, perhaps the idea that there's been a more political commission, which Barroso pushed for. Some people we talked to sort of suggest the idea, maybe, and also with all the crises going on in Europe and the need to hold the union together, maybe some were afraid of antagonizing member states with too many lawsuits, right? So that could be a factor in some areas. And then finally, there's a factor that the Commission has become more centralized over time, more presidential, right? With more, and that might, in a way, by centralizing control over infringements, it might discourage some of the lower level officials, the people who, discover a specific, problem involving bathing water in one place, or, solid waste disposal or something, from really putting all the effort in to pursue an infringement when it might be kind of later shot down from the center, right? So that's another potential factor. So last thought I will leave you with, since this is hosted by you, Sven, in the European Parliament, right? What's the role for the European Parliament? I would just say 3 things. I think it's important, that the Parliament, intensify its monitoring of Commission enforcement. Again, that doesn't mean to be hostile, but a role of any Parliament is monitoring the actions of an executive branch. And so that has to be true here too, right? And one way to do that, like all that data I showed you, I'll tell you, it was a pain in the neck to put together, because the way it's reported in the annual reports, they're not longitudinal. They don't give you like 40 years of data and things like that. And the way it's reported changes year to year. So it was a lot of work to actually do that. So I think the Parliament could ask for kind of consistent, comparable data, on these issues like environmental enforcement. And finally, when people who are bringing those complaints about non-enforcement or problems, aren't satisfied with the Commission choosing not to pursue an infringement, the Parliament maybe can reach out to them even more and encourage them to petition, to bring petitions, on those issues to the Parliament. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention, and I will end my screen share. Thank you.
This was excellent. Thank you, Dan. Very interesting. Do you have disaggregated data like this on cases of environmental law? Well,
as I showed you, we have the data on the overall trend in infringements in environmental law, which was one of my slides, right? You saw the decline in environmental infringements. We haven't, I think we could come up with it, but we have it on all those different issues, like let's say pilot procedures or all those, we don't have those all by issue area, right? So we have the general infringements, but not every single thing broken down by issue. And also the codings, it's very confusing because the EU expands the number of issues it's involved in over decades. So then the codings, change around like 2002. So to do this for 40 years is a challenge.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Thanks to you and your colleague Tommaso for that research. And now we move to those who actually do it on the job. So Anaïs Berthier, how do you see the development of the enforcement of EU environmental law? What are your experiences as a lawyer working for the Earth?
Hi, thank you. Well, first, I would like to thank you for the invitation. I'm really, really happy to be here with you today and to share our experience as an environmental law organization. And yes, well, I will speak about the lack of implementation of environmental legislation, both at EU and national level, because of course, it's important to bear in mind that the law should be implemented at these two levels. And first, EU environmental law is quite developed. I mean, we have a significant bulk of EU environmental legislation. It can, of course, be improved, and new EU policies and legislation should continue to be adopted, but it is quite significant. And so the main issue that we really face on the ground is really the lack of implementation and enforcement of the law. And that's in every field of environmental legislation, whether it is on climate, energy, air quality, biodiversity, nature, and so on. So that's really across the board. So we can have all the great laws that we want. If they are not implemented and enforced, then they won't achieve their aim, that is to protect the environment. So first at national level, so how can we ensure better implementation and better enforcement? I see two main ways. So infringement proceedings initiated by the European Commission, the possibility for members of the public to make complaints to the European Commission is an essential tool. It's really, really crucial. That's one of the most important tools that we have at our disposal. So it's essential. And it's important because sometimes that's simply the only remedy, legal remedy actually, that civil society has against violation of environmental law against by member states. So that is really important. And I think we've made quite, a good number of complaints to the European Commission. Some of them have led to infringement proceedings. Some of them are ongoing in different domains. So we do use that tool, of course. But I'd like to take that opportunity to raise the deficiencies that there are still in relation to the infringement proceedings. First, the lack of transparency. So unfortunately, the whole process is completely opaque. Even for the complainant. When someone makes a complaint, then we just don't have until the Court of Justice of the EU adopts a ruling, which may take years, sometimes 7 years. So we don't have access to the letter of formal notice sent by the European Commission to the member states. We don't have access to the reasoned opinion. We don't have access to the replies from the national governments to the European Commission. Complete opacity. And the citizens are kept in the dark for years. That means that they cannot know why and to what extent their national governments do not comply with the law. They don't know what are the arguments of the European Commission against the member states. And that is really difficult to understand actually why it's that way, because we cannot even support the European Commission in bringing infringement proceedings against the member states. That's what we would like to do. We actually would like to support the European Commission when they initiate infringement proceedings to put more pressure on the member states that are in violation of environmental legislation. And that's not possible. The EU pilot procedure that has been raised is of course completely opaque as well. We don't even have the name, against what states an EU pilot is open. For example, implementation of the fisheries regulation. Citizens cannot have access to any information on how the legislation on fisheries is implemented. We know, for example, that there are EU pilots against 14 member states. DG Mare doesn't want to tell us which ones they are, in violation of the recommendations of the European Ombudsman, to which we've made a complaint against that. So no accountability, neither from the member states, neither from the European Commission. And so, because we'd like also to know whether the European Commission puts enough pressure on the member states as well. So there's also the issue that, and that can explain as well the fact that the numbers go low, is that it is discretionary for the Commission to open an infringement proceeding or not. So that means that we cannot challenge that before the court. Two last points just on that. We actually think that the Commission should have more powers because it's such an important tool and power that citizens rely on, that it's a pity that the Commission only has investigative power in marine-related areas, marine fisheries-related areas, and we think that actually these investigative powers should be extended to other environmental matters, and so the Commission should have these additional powers as well. And the issue of shortage of staff, that we've been raising it with other NGOs, with Vice President Timmermans. There is an issue because there is only so much we can ask DG Environment. I'm sure Aurel will agree with me, and that there is a question of lack of staff. Like we cannot rely on DG Environment and the European Commission just to take all the complaints that we would like to make all the time, and especially in light of the adoption of the Green Deal, I think the number of staff in DG Environment hasn't increased, so that's an issue. The other way is, of course, to empower members of the public so that they can enforce themselves environmental legislation. And so that's what we are doing at ClientEarth and many other environmental NGOs, of course, and citizens. For that, there must be access to justice in environmental matters. So as you may know, there is still no directive on access to justice in environmental matters, which results in huge discrepancies between member states on the way access to justice is provided or not provided. I think according to the Milieu study, in half of the member states, broad legal standing is not provided to members of the public. So that means that members of the public cannot enforce environmental legislation. And we are also faced to these difficulties, and that's why we make complaints to the European Commission. For example, against Poland and Bulgaria for not having access to justice to challenge the lack of air quality plans adopted by national authorities. So that's why that since we still don't have a directive, and that it seems that now there's not only lack of political will within the Council, but maybe also within the European Commission, we agree and will encourage the European Commission to actually integrate access to justice provisions into sectoral legislation. And the European Commission has committed to doing so in its communication on access to justice. And so we really encourage the European Commission to do that. Unfortunately, it hasn't done so in the EU climate law, but the European Parliament has integrated an access to justice provision in the EU climate law that's discussed in trilogues, and we hope the Commission will support that access to justice provision and that the Council will do as well. Another opportunity that there is now, and we also welcome actually the proposal from the European Commission, is in relation to the Air Quality Directive. So the European Commission has adopted the Inception Impact Assessment on the revision of the Air Quality Directive and has made some really interesting policy options proposals to integrate new provision on sanctions and a framework to provide compensation actually at national level when the obligations under the Air Quality Directive are violated. So we really support that proposal and that option. We really think it's needed. More provisions to empower members of the public to enforce environmental legislation. And so more stronger provisions into EU law so that environmental legislation can be enforced at national level. So that's really important. I can go back on that if there are questions. And the second level is, of course, at EU level. And so, because, of course, European institutions also must ensure that EU environmental legislation is correctly implemented. Unfortunately, it's not always the case. For example, in relation to chemicals, there have been 6 resolutions from the European Parliament against decisions adopted by the European Commission to authorize the use of harmful chemicals. And so that shows as well that the European Parliament needs to play its role in ensuring that other European institutions comply with EU environmental legislation. But at that level as well, members of the public must also be able to enforce EU law before the Court of Justice of the EU. As you may know, the EU has been found in violation of the Aarhus Convention for not providing legal standing before the Court of Justice of the EU, following one of our communications before the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. As a result, the European Commission has decided to revise the Aarhus regulation, and that's really welcome. That's a really very significant step in the right direction. Unfortunately, the legislative proposal still does not completely comply with the Aarhus Convention. It is being discussed within the European Parliament now, and we really count on the European Parliament to step up and to adopt the relevant amendments to ensure that the legislative proposal finally complies with the Aarhus Convention, and so that NGOs, members of the public, can enforce environmental legislation at EU level as well. And I'll stop now, but I'm happy to reply to any questions on any of the points that I've raised. Thank you.
Thank you. This was an excellent example why we like to have competent NGOs. So I learned a lot. I think everybody learned a lot. And now it was, of course, hard to take. So poor Commission, they are used to it. Member States, Parliament, everybody trying to push you where one wants to have you. But now we are curious to hear your view on the situation of the effective implementation of EU environmental law and its enforcement. Please, Director, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting invitation to a very interesting panel. And I must say it's a pleasure. And also because it's a challenge. It is very interesting to participate in exchange with you. Good afternoon to all the co-panelists in Europe, and probably most of the audience is in Europe. Good morning to Professor Kelemen in Philadelphia. It's morning again in America, but maybe not in the sense of the 80s. Dear Mr. Giegold, if you allow me, I have had an idea about what would be interesting to share with you and with the audience here. So I prepared a short PowerPoint presentation, but I have heard also interesting and also very challenging remarks from Professor Kelemen and from Anaïs. We are used with the challenges raised by ClientEarth to the Commission. So I will try in a second part of my intervention, which I will try to keep still short, to address some of the issues that have been raised here. But first of all, I would like to try to share my PowerPoint presentation with you, and I hope I will not do too many mistakes. So I hope you can see my presentation and also can continue to hear me. So I wanted to give you a flavor about what represents the infringement work, the enforcement work of the department I am speaking about, to which I belong, DG Environment, in the enforcement work of the entire Commission. And you have here statistics which are not from yesterday. It's the latest available set of figures, active infringements for each Commission service. And you can see environment is, in spite of all criticism, still leading all the other services in terms of numbers. We have, I would say, 30% more than the next service in line, which means, of course, that we take this seriously. Some will argue, like you do, that maybe this is still insufficient. I will comment on the reasons of the insufficiency and on what means sufficient in a union of 27 member states, and also in a union that has developed over 30-40 years. An important part of the acquis, which is the legislation on environmental policy, which is quite complex. And I will give you immediately a flavor of what means this complexity, but I would say, so how this portfolio of enforcement is created. It is created based on a number of strategic choices which are necessary. In the light of the multitude of the member states, of the diversity of national situations, in the light of the significant implementation gap, and I can only agree with Anaïs that implementation is key. And I acknowledge here that the implementation gap continues to be a significant one, meaning in layman's terms, in human terms, the difference between what the member states have politically agreed in the Council and the reality on the ground. This is the implementation gap. When you decide 5 years ago or 10 years ago that yes, we will improve the air quality in our cities, or yes, we will improve the quality of our drinking waters, or we will reduce the quantity of nitrates from cows and pigs and from farms in the underground water, but you don't do it even after 5 years, even after 10 years, even after 30 years, in the case of some old pieces of legislation like the nitrates directive. So we look at the global picture, and unfortunately we are forced to choose by several factors, but primarily, I will tell you, is not the political considerations only, although political considerations play a role, and they must play a role also in our judgment, but the capacity of our human resources. In a union of 27, we would need hundreds of environmental lawyers only to deal with all the cases. So we must filter, and we filter as follows. The cases which are most important and the challenges which are most important are the structural ones. Structural means what are the key obligations? What are the key environmental outcomes pursued by a piece of legislation or by a set of pieces of legislation in one given area, biodiversity, or circular economy and waste management, or air quality, or water quality. These structural issues and these key outcomes have a fundamental value. So I will say, and I do not want to be cynical, and I know that, and we all agree that also individual problems, the fact that 10 citizens or 100 citizens have a problem with a particular landfill, or have a problem with the lack of protection of a particular Natura site is also important. But the structural, the lack of adequacy of the set of Natura sites in one given member state is even more important. The structural problems related to the insufficient, improper waste management in a given member state is even more important at the scale of the entire society in that member state than the situation of an individual landfill or of an individual site. In other words, what we are saying is not cynical. Societal interests and the environmental outcomes that benefit the entirety of or wider segments of the society in that member state have more value, not only politically for the reward of the European Commission, but also in the eyes of the citizens living in that society, in that member state. And we give a certain priority to these structural issues. And of course, we are guided by political considerations in the sense that we also, I think it's a matter of accountability, it's a matter of democracy, and it is normal. For instance, if the current Commission is guided by the European Green Deal that the President has committed for in the first weeks of her mandate, it was normal that the European Green Deal is also the compass not only for the lawmaking in the area of environment, climate change, energy policy, etc., but it's also the compass in the area of enforcing key obligations which have a systemic importance for the attainment of the political objectives of the European Green Deal. So we have discussed already in the early months of the mandate of this commission, which is no longer new. We have discussed with our commissioner how to reorient the enforcement work according to the compass of the European Green Deal and to a number of I'm sorry, I think I have a computer problem here. We are guided also, besides European Green Deal, by a number of key deliverables which, under the Green Deal, structure the policy making and the enforcement of the European Commission in the area of environment. The fact that there is a particularly important political commitment for a circular economy, a commitment for a zero pollution action plan and the zero pollution drive, the fact that there is a very important political commitment for the protection of biodiversity, and the biodiversity strategy, which was already adopted by the Commission, plays a role, obliges us I'm afraid I will have to stop sharing because I think you cannot see. Okay. So I hope now you can see better. So we had to take into consideration these political priorities. I really apologize. I have an update which is going on in the computer without me. I will try to detach myself from the workings of this computer and to revert to. Do you hear me? Stop sharing. Yes, I apologize. Okay, so it doesn't matter.
Everything looks fine.
Yeah, but maybe on your side, but on my side, I couldn't see completely my PowerPoint presentation, and I had an automatic update of the Apple computer, which I couldn't handle now. So I wanted to show you which are the political priorities that we have agreed with our commissioner in the key areas. Can you see my computer, my screen?
No, we are just seeing you, but not your screen.
Can you see now? Can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Okay, so maybe the problem is fixed. These are our two strategic priorities in the area of circular economy: illegal landfills and substandard landfills, and the absence of another structural instrument, which is key in the area of waste management plans and prevention programs. In the area of biodiversity, I'm running this a little bit in an accelerated way to recover for the time lost. We have a number of clearly identified priorities, making sure that the system of the nature protected areas are in place in their entirety in each member state, and that there are measures taken by the member states and enforced publicly and privately for the proper management of these nature protected areas. And in the area of zero pollution, I'm taking here the example of water. You can see what are the priorities that we have identified and agreed with our political masters. They relate to wastewaters. After 20 years since or even more, since the application, a bit more, since the application of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, it is high time to close the implementation gap in respect of all member states. And even the newer member states are now obliged to comply with these obligations. But not only urban wastewater, but nitrates are important. And you, Mr. Giegold, are familiar with a particular infringement procedure, which was not exceptional because we have taken action on nitrates against France, Germany, Poland, and other member states, and we are preparing more enforcement actions. Drinking water, it is important. In most of Europe, you have drinking water on the tap, at least in urban areas, but there are a few spots in some 3-4 member states where there are intolerable amounts of substances which are carcinogenic or dangerous for human health. And we are taking action because this is, again, a very important environmental outcome that has a direct impact on the individuals, on the humans. And the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. And to give you an example also which counts for zero pollution, but for air pollution, so persistent taking action against persistent exceedances, taking action against inadequate monitoring of air quality. Why? Because it is important to see what is the compliance gap or the implementation gap. So if you have proper monitoring, you have a clear picture about what is the situation in every agglomeration that matter. Taking action against installations that still function in a number of member states without complying with the conditions in their permits for functioning, or their permits are illegal, are not complying with the legal framework adopted at European level, and taking action against exceedances of emissions, industrial emissions. And even if there is no, how to say, separate political strategy on environmental governance. Reference to governance is made also in the European Green Deal, and we believe that it is important, and it's our fourth important priority area of action, to deliver a better environmental governance across all member states. So, and I'm coming to topics which have been mentioned here, at least by Anaïs. Action against unjustified restrictions to the access to justice of citizens, and Anaïs, because she has mentioned Poland and Bulgaria, you know that we have worked together on these cases, and the Commission has taken action, which is fairly advanced now, and will take more action in the immediately following months, maybe even these months, against other member states on unjustified restrictions on access to justice to citizens, and acting against unjustified restrictions concerning environmental impact assessments, which are fundamental if we want to deliver the European Green Deal, and also the protection of a better protection or a more effective fight against climate change, to put it like this. And I just wanted to give you a flavor, a more detailed flavor. I had other statistics as well. Unfortunately, when I transferred from a PC to an Apple computer, I did it only half an hour ago. So I saw that certain figures cannot be displayed on Apple. So only this one survived to the transfer. This gives you a more detailed, maybe because it was in a text version, this gives you an insight about what specifically we are doing on access to justice or environmental impact assessment. So what is hidden behind the aggregate figure that you saw at the beginning, 409 cases. These are part of the 409 cases, and we show you what we are doing, for instance, on environmental liability, where also access to justice is important, and what we are doing under the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And here I'm moving towards the second part of my intervention, and I will try to comment on a number of very pertinent points that and challenges that have been raised by Professor Kelemen and by Anaïs. So we are, for instance, profiting from the fact that in the last decade at least, the Court of Justice in Luxembourg has developed a particularly rich case law in terms of what are the obligations also of European institutions, but also of the member states under the Aarhus Convention. And this is my point about the lack of need for a legislative proposal on access to justice in environmental matters. Why should we resuscitate something that was proposed in 2003 and failed because the Council, so the member states, didn't want to hear about a directive on access to justice? So why we should again spend a few years at least in order to see this adopted, and a few years to see it transposed, and afterwards enforce the provisions in the case when they have not been transposed, when we can enforce directly the obligations for the member states that are spelled out in the judgments of the Court of Justice of the European Union. And we are already doing this. So instead of going from here to Paris via Madrid, to give you an example, we go from Brussels directly to Paris.
Director, may I ask you to come to your second part and conclude rather soon?
Yes, absolutely, and I apologize. So this is my point about the access to justice. I wanted to say something about why infringement procedures appear as having declined. I've provided a number of explanations because we need to concentrate on the structural issues. We simply do not have enough human resources in order to take all cases which are raised. So we need to do a certain filtering. The second element relevant here is that inevitably, and this is very good, we have to rely also on private enforcement. Private enforcement not only by the non-governmental organizations, but by the individuals themselves. This is why we are insisting on introducing provisions on access to justice in more and more instruments of environmental law. And the Commission has adopted a communication, so a policy document in October last year, which is indicating that we will insist with the Parliament and with the Council to introduce sectoral provisions on access to justice in order to secure the effectiveness of the rights under each directive which is being adopted. I will say also the following thing. Pursuing enforcement is not a purpose in itself. Bringing the member states to the Court of Justice is not a purpose in itself. The purpose is not the condemnation. The purpose is to attain the policy and environmental goals which have been intended by the co-legislators when they have adopted a regulation or a directive. And this is why we work also before enforcement with the member states, trying to find solutions to the problems without bringing them to the Court of Justice. So what you may perceive as a shortcoming is actually we try to make out the best of all the tools in our portfolio, and to in order to reduce this implementation gap. And my final comment is about transparency, in particular ClientEarth, but also you, Professor Kelemen, have been critical about the lack of transparency. I would still like to draw your attention to the fact that the Commission is publishing an annual report on the enforcement of EU law, where we provide elements and data, including about environmental enforcement. We also, the Commission is regularly publishing, so every 3-4 years, implementation, 5 years, implementation reports about individual pieces of legislation. And there you find also data about the enforcement of that piece of legislation. So there are elements which show what is going on, not in detail, and why the infringement procedures are covered by a certain confidentiality, because before opening or before bringing a member state to the court, we can still work a lot with the member states in the shadow of infringement procedures in order to encourage that member state to take corrective action. And we have obtained good results, working in the shadows, working in the dark, maybe in the secrecy, but good results for the citizens have obtained with this. And those complainants which have complained to the Commission, and we have launched enforcement procedures, infringement procedures on the basis of those complaints, have been kept informed that the Commission is working to bring a solution to their complaint, even if they have not been provided in detail with what we have agreed or what we have done. But they have seen at the end what we have done because the member state has taken a certain measure. Thanks a lot for your patience.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for presenting your work and also responding to a few of the points. I would now like to do the following. It's already quite late, but it was worth listening to each other. First, I would like to share with you something we sent to all the participants in advance. I collected all the infringement proceedings for Germany. We present also how long the proceedings take. And I invite everyone to collect and add to this collection. It's actually quite shocking because Germany is always saying we are the good guys, so we are strict on enforcement, we respect rules, and even more we tell others to respect rules. But in fact, when it comes to environmental law, we do not respect the rules. And I have to say, well, if one looks systematically at the cases, some of them are ongoing as long as the Hungarian case. So therefore, the good results, well, but I invite everyone, I shared it now with you, to add to our Google Sheet and add more information. Many have already done so, and I will follow that up. But now I would like to read you some of the top questions which have been asked here in writing, and I will also give the floor to a few participants. And I ask all the panelists to take notes and listen. So first, we have here Dr. Raphael Weiland, a well-known enforcer of EU environmental law. I'm sure Director, everybody here knows Raphael Weiland. He's asking lots of questions, but he actually asked the ones which were most liked. So first question to all the panel, arising from the conclusions of Professor Kelemen. Do you think structural systemic changes are needed to improve the situation within the Commission? And I forgot to mention, Raphael works for the Naturschutzbund, which is one of the largest German environmental NGOs, and he's also a lawyer. And the second question is directed to the director of the Commission, to Aurel. Are there analyses of how the enforcement staff capacity evolved in the Directorate General Environment over the last years? So how much staff do you have? So then there was a question, and I'll try to translate it. Was the transparency up to 2004, when the number of cases were still increasing, or also that as bad as described for today by Madame Berthier, or has the Commission changed anything when it came to transparency? I guess this is a question to Dan Kelemen. And I think I'll make first a point here. We have more questions to come. But to make this also a bit convivial, I would also like to try to give a few people directly the floor. And I see here first Anke Uhl. And I will try to open her microphone. This is a Zoom problem. Sometimes it's a bit annoying. Yeah. Anke, you would have to open your microphone. That is why I do mostly written questions, because in the end it's annoying. Always someone. Could staff work in the back on the microphone of Anke Uhl? If not, I would try next with Dimitrios Chrysafidis. Sorry about this.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes, this is working. Excellent.
Yeah, thank you. This is Dimitrios Chrysafidis speaking, representing an organization for the protection of pedestrian rights in Greece. I just want to raise two issues. Would be something like food for thought. The first issue relates to a case that we have faced as a movement here in Athens. We have complained to the European Commission about funding of some constructions in the Greek underground of Athens, where the accessibility of the pedestrians has not been taken into account. And we have received the easy reply from the Commission that we have problems to intervene because of the principle of the subsidiary So my question is this principle an easy excuse not to act for the Commission? And then the second issue relates to other sectors of the European legislation, for example, in the sector of food, where also I'm involved in. There is, for example, the FVO, Food and Veterinary Office, which used to undertake some inspections in the member states to check how far the authorities are proceeding to European law enforcement. And this was very active till 2010, this inspection body. But nowadays it's not so active anymore, but only the existence of this body has forced authorities to comply and to be very active in law enforcement in the sector of food. Why don't we create something similar also in the area of the environmental European law? Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, when it comes to the funding application, I think that is a bit outside of scope here, because we cannot discuss an individual funding case. But the second issue is highly critical, and actually we have exactly the same situation in Germany, that the monitoring of EU law is of course often a responsibility of the regions in some countries of the member states, but the level of monitoring is not everywhere the same and not always reliable. But now I would like to give the floor to Jürgen Resch, who has been very active in this whole field of enforcement of EU environmental law. I'm sure Director and knows him. So please, Jürgen.
So Sven, thank you very much for inviting, and I want to give my compliment to Anaïs for her perfect overview in many problems we see in the member states. I want to add some problems we mentioned the last year more and more. So the Commission is setting up very good rules and minimum standards, for example, in the environmental consumer protection. A consumer has to get the information about the efficiency of a product, about the fuel consumption of a car, the annual electricity use of a refrigerator, and so on. Besides the problem of implementing these rules, if industry is against, so we are focusing in Germany, for example, several years delay of a new WLTP standard for the fuel, for the correct fuel consumption data, the mileage data. We have another problem in law enforcement. So if as an industry who is, or a dealer who is not in line and he is not fulfilling the regulation, the authorities, either they don't control, or if they control, so we are checking it every year since 15 years, and now some of them are controlling, but if they find there's a big mistake, they don't do anything beside a talk. So there is no negative impact if Daimler or Volkswagen or Aldi or Edeka is cheating 100,000 of customers. There is no fine. And this is a big problem in the implementing environmental law. Anaïs told about the wide field of problems we have on the other side against the state, to bring the state to fulfill the air quality standards or the water standards. And Director, you mentioned, for example, the nitrate action plan, the nitrate problem we have with drink water. if now an NGO is going to court and is fighting for clean air, we did in 40 cases in Germany, up to now each single case successful. We even notice in a country like Germany that there are, beside the trial of restrictions to our ability to go to court, that there are real threats against the NGO. So government is announcing to stop them, to check the credibility in total, or to stop any kind of subsidies. So I have a little bit the fear for the next year if this development is going on. We have wonderful regulation, but the state is not implementing. There's no law enforcement for really bring these standards to industry and to the retailer. And on the other side, if civil society, I'm coming to the end, if civil society or private people try to do, they even have to mention that they are threatened. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I can only confirm that I was highly annoyed how some fellow politician threatened his organization with the loss of the charitable status. This was quite disgraceful in my view, but that is not the responsibility of the Commission. These are problems we will have to sort out ourselves. I see since quite some time Lisa Kuivasmäki speaking, so a Finnish name, which is always a challenge. Lisa, your microphone.
I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I want to talk about an incident that happened a while ago. A Norwegian investor was threatened with sanctions because he wanted to invest to the EU-Russia gas pipeline. And I would like to ask that, is this ordinary? Is this going to be happening? Is this the new normal? Is this what is going to happen, that the Green Agreement, Paris Agreement, now is doing well for the next 4 years because of Biden, but in the future, is there going to be a president in America again who threatens people who try to do green business? And is this going to be something that the American decision makers can do something about too? Because it is very important. It seems that Angela Merkel's follower is going to continue the gas pipeline line's existence, and that is, to my opinion, very wise. But these threats keep coming, and they are real, and it doesn't feel, or it isn't nice.
Yeah, thank you. I can only say that this is certainly not the opinion of the German Greens, but that doesn't matter. We are listening, of course. And now I would like to give the floor to two final persons. First, Axel Friedrich, and also to my good colleague Jutta Paulus. Perhaps we start with trying to, yes, Axel, please.
I think we have a big problem. We make nice legislation, but the enforcement is not existing. We don't have the laws to do this. I give you an example. We have a good regulation on diesel filters, but we have no European law to control that the filter is working. We have quite good legislation on air quality standards, but we have no really control how the monitoring stations are situated. So as an example, if you go to Bulgaria, if you go to Hungary, I have not found one single station which fulfills the requirement. No single one. I found many in Greece and many in Italy, which are really out of any range of measuring the right thing. Not to talk about other countries in Eastern Europe. So my question is, and I know you're limited forces of people, how we can overcome this problem. Because then the report the numbers are good. I give you in Sofia, they have 3 stations. None of the stations measure correctly NO2. None. By far not. I made measurements there, and they're 3 times higher than what they measure. And the same happened in Greece, the same happened in Italy, same in Romania, same in Hungary, same in Poland. How we solve the problem? Because all the measures, all the infringements are not possible to fulfill because we have no data. We have a big lack of data on this side. And my question is how we can get legislation, rules which force to check this. Because we have no idea in many countries what the situation is. I can give you the problem of wood combustion, a huge disaster. It's 45% of the black carbon emissions in the EU. It's 70 to 80% of benzoapirin. None of the action in the EU is really done in this area. It's in the design directive, which is not what I think is environmental legislation. Why are we not looking on this subject as we do with other sources? This is many of these problems I see which are not attacked, which are not fully. And
oh, sorry, this was a bit. Sorry, I was a bit
the problem is
I was a bit premature. Please, Jürgen.
There are so many complaints in Germany because NGOs are very strong. But if you go to Slovakia, if you go to Bulgaria, if you go to Romania, virtually no really NGOs exist to do the job. And this, they're not, I know what I'm talking. They have not the means, they have not the money, they have not the instruments. This is really a huge problem.
Thank you, Axel. I only have to say we have very good colleagues also in Bulgaria and Romania as NGOs, and it's but that is leaving that aside. I give now the floor to Jutta Paulus, and would just like to say that Jutta, together with our other good colleague Martin Häusling and myself, we just wrote today a complaint to the Ombudswoman because of a lack of a proper check when it comes to a road project in Germany by and the violation of the Habitat Directive. And the case is very famous. It's the Dannenröder Forst and the construction of a motorway there. And we hope that we get clarification over the lack of respect of EU and biodiversity law. Jutta, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Sven, for giving me the floor. And actually, my question relates to not only this case, but other cases also. We see it ever and again that member states want to proceed with infrastructure projects that are harming nature protection, Natura 2000 areas and the like. And usually the proceedings are the member states makes a cost benefit analysis and finds out, well, this has so much added value for society and we can find some way to protect another piece of nature, never mind that 250-year-old trees cannot be replaced so easily. And then they do a rather botched analysis, but we have the impression that DG Envy does not always have the staff and the resources to proper check all the assumptions that are being made and all the, well, how many minutes of travel are actually gained, how large is the added value for society in order to proper assess whether the cost benefit analysis has a real base or whether it's just a, well, we'll write something down so that the Commission will give its okay and not do any proper checks on that. Could you elaborate a bit on this? How is the usual proceeding in DG Envy? How many people do you actually have to really do a check of this kind of data? Thank you.
So I have to, I have to say sorry because I didn't give the floor to Claire Dupont. if it's the Claire Dupont of whom I think she has it, she clearly deserves to be listened to. She's a professor for Earth System Governance. So Claire, s'il te plaît, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm not this Claire Dupont.
Doesn't matter. We are curious anyway.
Claire Dupont, the environmental scene in Brussels. I'm the managing director of Milieu. And it's a consultancy, and we have been working a lot, are still working a lot with the Commission, in particular on compliance assessment and looking at implementation and so on and so forth. I'm not going to be long. I just want to put something on the table, which I think is important. There is effectively a deficiency in enforcement, but one of the aspects that has not been touched upon here and is very important in my view is also the level of sanctions, which sanctions are available and which sanctions are decided upon by the courts. As you know, there is a current review of the so-called Eco-Crime Directive, which sets up sanctions for economic, environmental crime. And I think it's also, an aspect that cannot be put aside when talking about enforcement. At the moment, the sanctions are very low. They are very different from one member state to another. And there is a lot of work to be done to improve the situation. Thank you.
Okay, so this was quite a challenge for our presenters, but this is the space also for such questions. So please, let's try perhaps to start with ClientEarth. With Anaïs, you received quite a lot of encouragement, but perhaps you want to comment also on some of the things the director said. I would say you cannot answer to all, but I give you first 5 minutes each, and then I will conclude rather soon. So,
okay.
Yeah, please, Anaïs.
Thank you. So I'll react quickly to what has been said. Well, of course, I cannot agree with the fact that we don't need an access to justice directive, because simply of everything that has been said, all the issues, legal hurdles that members of the public have to go through or to have access to justice and to be able to enforce environmental legislation. So only a directive could actually solve all these issues and ensure a level playing field among the different member states. And that's really, really super important, because it's not even sure that we will manage with the Commission, with the Parliament, to integrate access to justice provisions into sectoral laws. To be fair with the Commission, they've already tried, and the Council has not supported them. And it's not sure that the Council will support it, the one in the EU climate law or air quality directive. So, I mean, so what? So then we still don't have any access to justice provisions into any of the directives. So then, according to the Commission, the solution is to go before national courts and to ensure that the national courts make a referral for a preliminary ruling, and that's what Aurel was saying, to the Court of Justice of the EU. But to do that, you need to have access to justice at national level. And then the court needs to agree to put a referral for a preliminary ruling to the Court of Justice. If it agrees, it expands the whole proceeding of 18 months on average, and then it needs to be implemented at national level. So we do need an access to justice directive. We do need access to justice provisions into sectoral laws, but let's see if the member states support them or not. So that's really an issue. Claire, I mentioned the sanctions. Indeed, stronger sanctions, and here we support the Commission's thinking process in the framework of the revision of the Air Quality Directive. Sanctions, high financial penalties, in line with the case law of the court. Again, the court that said that that high financial penalties had to be provided to the members of the public, including to ensure that when we do have a positive ruling from national courts, the authorities comply with rulings from the courts, because it's not even the case. We had the case in Germany. A minister declared publicly that he was not going to comply with a ruling from the court in air quality matters. So that's why we had that, my colleague Hugo Tadei and with German NGOs managed to have the referral for preliminary ruling. And the court said, well, we need coercive measures in that case, including high financial penalties. On the question from Raphael, do we need systemic structural changes within the DG environment? More staff, that's clear. More transparency. I don't believe in opacity, confidentiality, working for the benefit of the public. No, especially when it takes like 7 years, or that like in France, I think that's the case you were referring to in relation to nitrates. Bretagne is still not complying, even though they were condemned by the court. And investigative powers, more investigative powers to the European Commission in that field as well. And maybe an old project that maybe Milieu, Claire worked on, I don't know, the need for maybe rules, procedures to regulate the way infringement proceedings are conducted. In theory, if you look at the website of the European Commission, the member state is supposed to reply 2 months in 2 months following the letter of formal notice. It's really not the case. So specific rules. Thank you.
Director. Merci, Anaïs.
Thank you very much. Because the first person who intervened from the audience and Mrs. Paulus asked the same question. What is the staff capacity of the DG Environment in enforcement? I will give you 2 figures and you will judge for yourselves. I will say the following. Currently, I have 23 colleagues working for 27 member states. This is the first figure. The second figure is the following. As you know, in the Brexit negotiations, one of the topics for discussion was, and the requirement from the Commission and from the European Union was that the competencies for enforcement of the Commission are taken by a new body in the United Kingdom. So the role of the Commission will be played in the future by a public enforcer in the UK system. This system, which is called Office for Environmental Protection, was set up. I had a lawyer covering the United Kingdom. How many staff do you think that the Office of Environmental Protection in the UK has? 140. For one member state, for one member state. So I think this speaks volumes, 2 figures. The second question, Mr. Chrysafidis, you spoke in positive terms about the value of inspections in general and the value of the Greek inspection body in food and veterinary matters. And I fully agree that environmental inspectorates are also very useful. And I would like to reassure you that Greece has such an environmental inspectorate body, and that each member state of the European Union has environmental inspectors, and we work hand in hand with them. It is a European network called Impel, with whom we meet regularly, and they are, we try to help each other, and in a way, they are an extension of the Commission. We try to support their activity as well as much as we can. So you can be relatively reassured, but they undergo, why relatively? Because they are also under pressure in budgetary terms and in staffing terms. This is the reality. To Mr. Resch, you have raised, among others, the problem of the threats against NGOs. I think we have received in the past a parliamentary question some 2-3 years ago when the first threats took place, and the Commission has made clear its opinion that such threats are incompatible with democratic rules in the member states as a general matter. And I understand that there has been an evolution, a positive evolution in the thinking of the political actors vis-à-vis such threats. So they have stopped such threats. To Mrs. Kuivasmaki from Finland, indeed, she raised the problem of the violence against the Norwegian investor. Now, of course, the gas pipeline is a polemic topic, but legally speaking, it has been authorized and it has been considered by all the riparian states to the Baltic Sea as being lawfully executed. And I would say the following: not the physical violence is the problem is a solution to societal problems. Societal problems in a democracy must find non-violent solutions. And I hope very much that the Finnish law enforcement authorities can curb this violence or the risk of violence. To Mr. Friedrich, you raised, among others, the problem of air quality monitoring stations. We cannot agree more with you about the importance of this, and I hope you have seen my erratic PowerPoint presentation. On one slide, I have indicated that one of our priorities in terms of air quality protection is to make sure that the air quality stations, air monitoring stations, which are mandated by the European rules, function properly across all member states. And we have taken to court several member states for deficiencies in air quality monitoring stations. So we are on the back of this problem and we will solve it. I want to reassure you. Mrs. Paulus, in addition to the staff issue, has raised the problem of infrastructure projects. Controversial, but if they are lawfully authorized, they must go forward. But you have rightly pointed to the fact that sometimes certain evaluations and balance between general interest and nature protection interest is made and rigged a little bit. And we follow you entirely. The Commission has systematically insisted that such projects must all undergo an environmental impact assessment and an appropriate under the EIA directive and an appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive. Such assessments should put on the table of the decision makers and on the table of the public the arguments to make a proper balance of interest and not a rigged one. So we will pursue the compliance with the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and with the Habitats Directive. Also, in the period to come, our portfolio is rich of cases of enforcement. We want to fix these problems. Mrs. Dupont, whom I am saying good evening because we have a lot of written administrative correspondence with her and I am hearing her live for the first time. You raised two problems, the problem of the Environmental Crime Directive. This is under revision. Another service of the Commission is in the lead of this. It's DG Justice, but we work hand in hand with them, in particular in order to look at the level of the sanctions and also at the definition of some loose terms which exist currently in this directive, and we want to make them clearer. And as a general matter, as a general comment about the problem of the sanctions, we work together with my colleagues in DG Environment to see how these generic provisions in the different directives requesting member states to apply proportionate and dissuasive sanctions, and there is another third term which is used, but I don't remember it right now, how this obligation is met by the member states in different areas. And we have started with the area, with the Water Framework Directive. And there is an investigation concerning all member states now taking place. It required a lot of work in order to launch it, but we will follow this, we will pursue this, we will find out what are the sanctions in the area of water protection in all member states, and we will take action. This is why we investigate. Either the problem is solved, and we will work with the member states for constructive solutions and quick solutions, or if not, we will open infringement procedures, and we will do so in other areas as well. But this requires time because we need to juggle with many oranges at the same time. Many are in the air, and we only have 23 pairs of arms. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. That was, I think, very impressive, and one could feel the problem in which...
It's frozen.
Oh. Can the others give me a signal whether you hear me? Okay. So I said that was very impressive, and one could hear that beyond all the criticism you heard today, we all know that you are in a truly difficult situation. Professor Kelemen, please. Dan.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'll be brief, and especially since the previous speakers, I think, addressed a lot of the specific questions posed. Maybe I'll try to touch on some of them with some broader points. And I'm certainly, the point of my presentation here wasn't to criticize the Commission or any other EU actor. I'm just raising these questions about these trends, right? And I guess here's what I'd say as my final reflections. As Walter Hallstein, the first president of the Commission, famously said, the EU, or then the European Community, is a community based on the rule of law, right? It's a unique construction in how much it relies on law as its backbone. The EU isn't a state, right? There's no police, right? It's really a legal creation. But for law to be meaningful, it of course must be enforced. And if the perception spreads, right, that EU law can be violated with impunity, right, in the environmental field or any other field, if that perception starts to spread, then a community that's based on law can start to unravel. So it's a real risk, this issue, right? And far beyond the issues of environmental law into all fields, but also in environmental law. Now, environmental law is one of the biggest areas of EU law, and it's one which, as the director showed us, where the Commission is most active in infringements, right? Or is the most active. So it's not like environment deserves to be singled out more than other areas for lax enforcement. Environment, there are a lot of infringements. But if we take a step back to think about my, trends about the decline over time, I think, as I was saying in my explanations of maybe why this is happening, I think in the 2000s, the Commission became more and more sensitive to criticisms, a lot of them from the UK, frankly, but from other, countries as well, that that the EU did excessive regulation, too much litigation. And, maybe on some points there was some validity to that in some cases. I think, in my view, maybe they took in that criticism a bit too much, right? In terms of self-limiting infringements, right? I think it's a question of like Goldilocks, in the story of the porridge, not too hot, not too cold, just right. It's not like every case should be an infringement with immediate, it's not like there's no place for trying to work it out. But on the other hand, you can't solve everything through dialogue. Sometimes you go to court. So, and on that point, I think the points that Ms. Berthier made about access to justice, I think access to justice initiatives would help, and for all the reasons she said. But even if there's better access to justice or a new directive and that sort of thing, I think we still have to keep in mind decentralized enforcement by private actors. While it is crucial for the system to function, it can never be a complete substitute for infringements. We all have to remember the two need to work together, right? So both need to happen. And infringements have unique powers behind them, and they can lead eventually to sanctions, Article 260 penalties, etc. And I guess the very last thing I'd say is this: Just the Commission is always going to have discretion in enforcement. I don't think we can ever make infringements somehow mandatory, and that's always going to raise questions. One of the commentators, Kammerlander, had asked, was it more transparent before 2004? No, there's always a lack of transparency, and I think greater transparency, as Ms. Berthier said, would help for outsiders to know what's going on with this process. I think it would actually help the Commission to have more leverage if it was more transparent in these. But even then, that being said, I guess the last thought I'll leave you with is, even with more transparency and all this, there's always going to be a bit of a tension in the very structure of the EU between the Commission's role as the guardian of the treaties and the enforcers, or the enforcer, and its role as the initiator of legislation and lawmaking. The Commission, I think, just let's face it, if you're trying to get member states to agree to some like Green New Deal legislation, new big initiatives, and then you're suing them like the same day, there's a tension, right? And I'm not here to resolve that, but I think that's a big structural thing that, we all need to think about. And that's maybe where the Parliament, Sven, is important to keep that pressure, for enforcement, so that doesn't get swept under the rug in the name of big new initiatives. So sorry if I went on too long, but I'll stop with that.
Well, thank you very much. That was really rich, the questions, your inputs, and I would like to draw some first conclusions from my side. So first, I think the numbers of the day were very clear. First, in the opening, the number of infringement cases going down, while actually the bulk of EU legislation is still increasing. Not the number of new laws, but as we say, the acquis is larger, and still the number of active cases going down. That is a reason of concern, and it's also even more concerning that this also is true for environmental law. At the same time, we saw in environmental law, the Commission is particularly active. Nevertheless, that they are so active, we hear from very different pieces of evidence, also from the work of ClientEarth, that actually, and we heard it from many speakers here who raised their voice, that the reality is that we have a lot of non-implementation, a bad monitoring, low levels of sanctions. And then when we had unfolded that picture, the Commission told us the number of staff who has to deal with all this. And I think that is a really important point to make. So we can only expect outcome if there are the right resources. And I have to say, Professor Kelemen, I think, speaking the truth, the same tension which the Commission is facing is also faced by parliaments. Politicians like to enact new legislation, to toughen legislation. Year after year, to look after implementation is seen as boring, is seen as political fruitless. You don't catch the headlines, but I think that is wrong. Implementation is equally important, and there are very important symbolic cases of non-implementation. And I can only say we will follow it up, and I will do that work for the years to come. And I'm absolutely determined to give more, to put more political energy into enforcement of environmental law. You mentioned the Water Framework Directive, Director, and this is one of my favorite cases besides the air quality issues. Our rivers are supposed until 2027 to be in a good natural and chemical status. They are not. There are not even plans to get there. So therefore, that is a major issue when we have long-term targets, because it takes time and the member states don't take action. There have also to be infringement cases. We have the same problem with ammonium from mass animal farming with the National Emission Ceiling Directive, where we have long-term violations, but as targets are long-term, enforcement action is too reluctant. And I think that is hard to explain to citizens. And lastly, I have my list of infringement cases for Germany, which are in a bad status, took too long, and we will follow it up. And I would like to take up one point which Dan just made. When Juncker said we are now political commission, I have to say I was a bit suspicious. I would like to have a real European government. I admit it, I'm a European federalist. But as long as the Commission is at the same time guardian of the treaty, political commission may not mean we pick and choose where European law is enforced by European priorities. So I believe this is a community of law. And if citizens complain about the non-implementation, if enterprises complain, if NGOs complain, they they deserve to be listened. So there's no pick and choose. The law has to be enforced. I know this is not the reality, but this is what is in the treaty. So there's no pick and choose in the guardian of the treaty. And I think it's not acceptable, and it's even less acceptable if it leads to 400,000 premature deaths, like the violation of the Ambient Air Quality Directive. And therefore, I would plead to the whole community here, let's continue that work, you and the NGOs, in academia, in the Commission, to get European law enforced. And use the public space to support this. And I think there's one common takeaway. We should all demand that where we have priorities, there should be the respective staff deployed. And that is an important message. I take it home. And then we heard access to justice. Yes, this is really important. And there was the question directed to me, where is now this piece of law in the European Parliament? We heard already some skepticism in the Council. In the Parliament, we are waiting for the report to come. Once the report is there, obviously our ENVI committee will try its best, but I cannot say when this report is finally there. Only when the report is there, we can work on it. We are looking forward to being lobbied by good lobby on this, and I wish you well, and I will share with you by afterwards the recordings of this so that it can be spread. It is worth being spread, and you can all complement my list of violations and presumed infringements of EU law in Germany. We will follow it up. I wish you well. I thank you for all your input, and thank you for your good work. See you again in this theater already tomorrow. We have another webinar to evaluate the Brexit deal as the German Green delegation. And next week, I'm looking forward to welcoming the ambassador of India, who will demand with us to open up the patents on the COVID-19 vaccine. So looking forward to meeting you again in Europe Calling. Let's keep Europe online connected while we are all trying to get out of this COVID mess together. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.